What if an army's grand plan collapsed in less than 72 hours? Not from enemy fire, but from being outfoxed, outwatched, and outmaneuvered before a single shot was fired. Imagine the tension, the anticipation, the sense of a meticulously crafted operation, unraveling with breathtaking speed. This is not a hypothetical. In late October, year 2025, the Ukrainian military faced exactly such a catastrophe, and the consequences would echo far beyond the battlefields of Zaporizhzhia. In the waning days of autumn, Ukrainian forces entrenched in the Zaporizhzhia sector were at their breaking point. Imagine being a soldier in one of these frontline brigades, battered by months of relentless combat. Your comrades beside you, as many as 7 out of every 10, have fallen or been wounded. The tanks and armored vehicles you once relied on are now blackened wrecks, lining pockmarked roads. Food is scarce, ammunition is rationed, and the cold, wet wind of autumn cuts through every layer of uniform. Morale has cratered to the lowest point since the war began. Officers and enlisted alike share the haunted, hollow-eyed look of men and women who have witnessed too much. Commanders, surveying the ruined state of their units, saw only one slim hope: a massive, rapid rotation, pull out the exhausted, decimated brigades and replace them with fresh, fully equipped reserves. This was not a luxury, but a necessity. Without immediate relief, the front might not just bend, but snap entirely, opening the heartland of Ukraine to enemy exploitation. The stakes could not have been higher. On paper, the plan was elegant. Newly formed Marine brigades, trained and held in reserve far from the front lines, would move up quietly, using the nation's intricate web of railways and highways to slip into position. The entire operation was to unfold in under 72 hours. Ukrainian leadership gambled that the autumn mud and worsening weather would serve as an ally, blinding Russian eyes in the sky and complicating the enemy's ability to launch precise, long-range strikes. Speed, secrecy, and the elements would be their shield. But history is littered with the wreckage of plans that looked flawless in the briefing room. Every military historian knows the adage: no plan survives first contact with the enemy. In this case, the flaw was not in the plan's logic, but in its assumptions. Ukrainian command fatally underestimated the reach and sophistication of Russian reconnaissance, signals intelligence, and precision strike capabilities. They calculated that the Russians would be slowed by mud and cloud, that their drones and satellites would be grounded or blinded. They were wrong. Within hours of the rotation's commencement, Russian forces had already mapped the logistical routes, pinpointed reserve movements, and prepared a devastating response. This was not mere good luck or isolated brilliance. It was the result of a systematic, deeply integrated approach to modern warfare, one that fused satellite imagery, human intelligence, drone surveillance, and electronic eavesdropping into a seamless, real-time picture of the battlefield. The Ukrainians were playing chess. The Russians were playing three-dimensional chess, and they had already seen several moves ahead. The result was swift and catastrophic. Entire columns of Ukrainian troops and armored vehicles were struck before they even neared the front. Rail lines, highways, and key logistical infrastructure were shattered with surgical accuracy. The plan, which had seemed so promising just days before, unraveled almost instantly. The cost was measured not just in men and machines, but in the loss of strategic initiative, the one currency that cannot be replaced in war. This was not just a tactical defeat or a failed maneuver. It was a decisive warning to every modern military. In the age of information warfare, anticipation and adaptability outweigh brute strength. In Zaporizhzhia, the old rules of war, rules that had guided armies for centuries, were rendered obsolete in less than 3 days. To truly grasp the full scale of this collapse, and to understand why the operation was doomed from the start, we need to step back. What exactly set the stage for this pivotal, almost inevitable failure? The roots of the disaster lay not just in the days before the operation, but in months, even years, of shifting tactics, technological innovation, and a race between adversaries to master the new tools of 21st-century conflict. This was not an isolated blunder, but the climax of a long, invisible struggle for dominance in the information domain. Picture the front in late October. A tense hush hangs over the trenches. There is no thunder of artillery, no rumble of tanks, just the slow, grinding bleed of exhaustion. Both sides nurse their wounds, but beneath the surface, Ukraine's lines are fraying. Commanders know the truth. Their men are at the end of their rope, and the enemy is watching, waiting for the moment to strike. By this time, the Zaporizhzhia sector has become a graveyard of failed summer offensives. Ukrainian formations, once the pride of the army, are battered and exposed. The 115th Mechanized Brigade, the 82nd Air Assault, legendary names, now reduced to shadows of their former strength. Some units have lost up to 70% of their manpower and virtually all of their heavy equipment. It is not just the material losses that matter, but the psychological toll. Soldiers stand guard with hollow eyes, running on adrenaline and sheer willpower, their nerves stretched to the breaking point. For the Ukrainian High Command, there is no alternative. A complete rotation is the only option. The most battered brigades, stretched from Kamińske to Vuhledar, will finally be pulled off the line and sent to the rear to rest, recover, and regroup. In their place will step two newly formed Marine brigades, assembled and trained in the relative safety of Mykolaiv. These are not just replacements, they are the last trusted reserves in the entire sector, the final ace up Ukraine's sleeve. On paper, the switch looks routine. In practice, it is a logistical moonshot. The plan calls for secretly moving several thousand troops and hundreds of heavy vehicles in less than 3 days, relying on key railways and highways threading the rear. The entire operation depends on two factors: speed and stealth. Command bets on the weather. Heavy clouds and rain, they hope, will blind Russian eyes in the sky, grounding drones and sealing out reconnaissance flights. If the weather holds, it might cloak the entire operation, leaving Russian missiles and surveillance scrambling to catch up. This is not an unreasonable hope. Throughout history, armies have relied on the elements to mask their movements. In World War II, for example, the Allies used fog and bad weather to conceal the D-Day landings. In the Korean War, General MacArthur's surprise landing at Incheon succeeded in part because of tidal conditions and weather that masked the amphibious assault. But as countless commanders have learned, the weather is an unreliable ally at best. The Ukrainian planners' bet, in hindsight, was built on sand. They fatally underestimated the reach of Russian technology, the speed of their intelligence networks, and the sophistication of their data fusion. They believed the enemy would react slowly or stick to old habits, never realizing that the battlefield itself had changed beneath their feet. The Russians had spent years investing in a multi-layered reconnaissance strike complex, blending old and new methods to create a seamless, real-time picture of the battle space. What was truly at stake was far more than a stretch of ground. The survival of shattered brigades, the cohesion of Ukraine's defenses, and the fate of the last strategic reserves all teetered on this single, high-risk maneuver. Failure would mean more than lost territory. It threatened morale, lives, and the very direction of the war. It was a moment that would define not just a campaign, but the trajectory of the entire conflict. How did a seemingly routine rotation become a blueprint for disaster? What flaws in planning and adaptation doomed this desperate gamble in the fog of modern war? To answer these questions, we must delve into the invisible war, where satellites, sensors, and algorithms decide victory before the first shots are fired. Imagine facing an enemy who can foresee your every step before you even make it. For the Ukrainian High Command, this nightmare became reality in late October, year 2025. Their ambitious rotation of fresh troops in the Zaporizhzhia sector, meant to revitalize a sagging front, unfolded instead into a meticulously engineered trap. Russian intelligence had been preparing for months. Their constellation of satellites, tightly networked with covert agents, picked up the earliest signs of movement. Weeks before a single train left its depot, rail hubs at Uman and Kirovohrad were under continuous, silent observation. Every shipment of troops and armored vehicles was logged, time-stamped, and tracked with clinical precision. Above the shifting railcars, drones maintained a constant vigil, day and night. These were not merely passive observers. Using advanced optics and thermal sensors, they transmitted real-time visuals and data. The routes, the timing, even the exact points where trains would halt for refueling or transfer. Meanwhile, electronic eavesdropping intercepted communications, piecing together the entire logistical ballet, down to the battalion, down to the hour. 3 layers of surveillance, space, air, and ground, merged to create a living, breathing map. Russian analysts did not just know where the columns were. They understood their makeup, their command nodes, the very identities of the units on the move. By the time the first Ukrainian reserves neared the front, their entire journey had already been plotted, their vulnerabilities pinpointed. With this intelligence, Russian planners crafted a devastating fire plan. Instead of simply bombing the rails, an approach easily mended, they went after the system's arteries, railway substations, and the load-bearing supports of critical bridges. These were not quick fixes. Destroyed, they would cripple entire sections of the rail network for days, if not weeks, creating cascading delays and bottlenecks. This was not unprecedented. During World War II, the Allies launched Operation Strangle, targeting German railways in Italy to paralyze troop movements. The Russians, in 2025, were applying the same principle with 21st-century precision. The effect was instantaneous and ruinous. Precision missile strikes severed the logistical lifelines. Trains loaded with troops and heavy armor were forced to halt in exposed countryside, immobilized targets for Russian rocket artillery and loitering munitions. Each hour stranded in the open heightened their peril. In one example, a battalion's rail convoy was struck near the village of Pavlohrad, its cars ripped apart by Iskander missiles and subsequent drone-guided rocket salvos. Survivors reported the sheer panic of being caught in the open, with nowhere to run, as overhead drones relayed their positions to distant artillery batteries. With rails cut, Ukrainian units tried to improvise, pushing onto the roads. But the highways too had been mapped and marked. Artillery lay in wait at predictable choke points. Drone swarms and attack helicopters scoured the columns, hunting isolated vehicles with relentless accuracy. One convoy, attempting to detour through secondary roads near Pokrovsk, found itself bracketed by Russian Lancet drones and Mi-28 helicopters, losing over half its vehicles in less than 20 minutes. Some Ukrainian groups attempted to slip through in small convoys or under darkness, hoping to disappear into the night. It was futile. Russian drones, equipped with thermal sensors, swept the roads after sundown, detecting even the smallest heat signatures. Each attempt at stealth became another opportunity for a precise strike. In one documented case, a platoon that left its vehicles and tried to cross a field on foot was discovered by overhead drones, which guided cluster munitions directly onto their position. Within 48 hours, the rotation collapsed into chaos. The bulk of Ukraine's strategic reserves were shattered or scattered before they could reinforce the front. Entire formations were annihilated, equipment abandoned, morale broken, the promise of relief snuffed out. It was a stunning reversal. Thousands of lives and irreplaceable materiel lost, all without a single new battalion bolstering the exhausted defenders. For Ukraine's command, the lesson was brutal. In the new era of war, information dominance and adaptability count for more than raw numbers. The balance of power had shifted, not at the front line, but in the silent war of signals, sensors, and split-second decisions. This disaster forced Ukrainian leaders to confront a dangerous new reality. Without control over the information domain, even the bravest troops could be rendered powerless. But as the shockwaves rippled through command, a desperate search began for ways to regain the initiative, before the next blow fell. What happens when rescue becomes ruin, and hope turns to isolation? On the first line near Zaporizhzhia, Ukrainian brigades waited for relief that never came. Promised reinforcements and supplies were delayed, then vanished. Stranded, These defenders faced a nightmare barrage: endless Russian artillery, swarms of drones, and mounting casualties that eroded their strength by the hour. In a scene reminiscent of the encirclement of German forces at Stalingrad, the defenders found themselves isolated, cut off from help, and subjected to unrelenting bombardment. Russian assault teams moved in, small but methodical, always under the eyes of first-person view drones. They probed for every crack, each push weakening the battered Ukrainian positions. The defenders, already exhausted, were forced into a sleepless, nerve-shredding cycle, alert for attacks that never seemed to end. In some sectors, Russian squads used loudspeakers to broadcast taunts and psychological warfare messages, echoing tactics used in the siege of Leningrad during World War II. Then the heavy flamethrower barrages began. Fire rolled across trenches, turning dugouts into ovens and fortifications into charred ruins. The terror was immediate and total. Squads broke, morale shattered, and the will to fight began to bleed away with each hour of smoke and flame. Flame weapons, once thought relics of 20th century warfare, proved brutally effective in the confined spaces of modern trench lines. Now trapped, the soldiers faced a brutal choice. They could wait for attrition to finish them off, or gamble on desperate counterattacks doomed from the start. Both options only led to more casualties, chaos, and the slow, irreversible collapse of any organized defense. Russian electronic warfare delivered the final blow. Jamming blinded Ukrainian drones, cut Starlink terminals, and severed command links. Battalion radios went dead. Orders failed to reach the trenches. Panic spread in intercepted transmissions, confused arguments, refusals to obey, desperate pleas for permission to retreat, all echoing across the front. In one recorded case, a company commander spent hours trying to re-establish contact with headquarters, only to discover that the entire chain of command had been silenced by targeted jamming. In less than 3 days, the defense disintegrated. Ukrainian units, stripped of communication and leadership, splintered into isolated pockets, each cut off, each overwhelmed. The first defensive line ceased to exist as a fighting force, leaving gaping holes that could not be closed. The collapse resembled the sudden disintegration of the French front in May 1940, when German panzers broke through and shattered the coordination of Allied defenses. What was at stake was far more than lost ground. The collapse risked mass casualties, the breakdown of unit cohesion, and the very real possibility of an irreparable breach in Ukraine's southern defense. Had the Russians chosen to exploit the gap immediately, they might have reached the Dnipro River with little opposition, a scenario that would have changed the war's entire trajectory. The disaster was not a simple failure of courage or tactics. It was a lesson in how modern warfare punishes those who underestimate the power of technology and information. The parallels are clear. Just as the British suffered at the hands of German U-boats in World War I for ignoring the submarine threat, or as the French fell to the blitzkrieg by relying on static defenses, so too did the Ukrainians pay the price for misreading the nature of the modern battlefield. Why did everything unravel so quickly, and was disaster inevitable? It began with a fatal misjudgment. Ukrainian command misread the Russian threat, treating them as if they were facing an enemy from a bygone era. They assumed Russian surveillance and strike reach still suffered from the old limitations, and planned accordingly. In reality, those gaps had vanished. Predictability magnified the problem. Ukrainian planners followed familiar operational blueprints. Troop routes, assembly points, and logistics chains mirrored patterns seen in past conflicts. Russian intelligence, empowered by modern sensors and data analysis, quickly mapped these routines, turning routine into vulnerability. This is a classic military pitfall. During the Yom Kippur War, Israeli forces were surprised by Egyptian and Syrian attacks precisely because their enemies' intentions were masked by routine activity and deception. Technology, meant to be Ukraine's edge, became a hidden trap. Their communications network relied almost entirely on Western commercial infrastructure, with Starlink forming its backbone. When Russian electronic warfare targeted these links, the result was immediate paralysis. Orders could not flow, units were stranded, confusion spread. It is a stark reminder that technological superiority is only an advantage when it is resilient and secure. Yet perhaps the most damaging failure was psychological. Even as the plan unraveled, Ukrainian commanders refused to deviate. They fed reserves into zones the Russians had already prepared, sacrificing fresh troops to the same traps and compounding the losses. Adaptation gave way to stubbornness, and the operation bled out. This echoes the tragic persistence of World War I generals, who ordered repeated frontal assaults into withering machine gun fire, unable to imagine a new way forward. None of these mistakes stood alone. Together, they exposed a systemic weakness. In modern war, the side that adapts faster and deceives better triumphs, regardless of numbers or raw courage. Mastery over logistics, information, and technological resilience now decides battles. As the Prussian military theorist Karl von Clausewitz warned, war is the realm of uncertainty, and only those who embrace uncertainty and adapt with speed can hope to prevail. But the danger goes deeper than a single defeat. Repeating these errors risks wasting hard-won resources, destroying morale, and undermining every level of command. For any nation, the price of failing to adapt is not just lost territory, it is a future defined by avoidable loss and eroded confidence. The lessons from Zaporizhzhia are not confined to Ukraine, or even to this conflict. They are universal. So, what lessons linger for tomorrow's wars, and for every observer, policymaker, or professional invested in their outcome? To understand the future, we must examine how control over technology and information now outweighs sheer manpower. The next chapter reveals what must change to avoid repeating these costly mistakes, and how nations, large and small, can prepare for the new face of war. If the rules change, will you realize it before the ground disappears beneath your feet? The debacle of the Ukrainian troop rotation in Zaporizhzhia was not a simple failure of logistics or unfortunate weather. Instead, it revealed a harsh new truth. In the 21st century, victory belongs to those who command information, adapt relentlessly, and question every inherited assumption, including their own. Meticulous plans, no matter how precise, can become deadly snares when the enemy rewrites the script in real time. The old calculus of attrition and brute force crumbles against an opponent wielding a deeply integrated intelligence machine, one that blends satellites, drones, cyber intrusions, and human assets into a single, vigilant presence. The Russians did not merely respond to Ukrainian moves. They anticipated them, shaped them, and dictated the terms of the fight. Russian forces did not just outgun their rivals, they consistently outthought, outmaneuvered, and outpaced them. From surveilling rail movements hundreds of kilometers beyond the front to dissecting every node in Ukraine's logistics web, Russian analysts mapped, anticipated, and disrupted their foes' intentions before a single new brigade could take its position. This is the modern embodiment of the OODA loop: observe, orient, decide, act, developed by U.S. Air Force Colonel John Boyd. The side that cycles faster through this loop, that adapts and reacts with greater agility, will seize and maintain the initiative. For Ukrainian commanders, what appeared to be a routine rotation was, in fact, a passage straight into an elaborately engineered trap. Their dependence on familiar routes, unsecured communication channels, and outdated assumptions about Russian reach sealed their fate. The outcome was not only heavy casualties, but the collapse of a crucial operational plan, and a warning for all who bear witness. Today, the winners of war are those who merge intelligence, technology, and agility into every decision. Those who cling to the rules of yesterday or fail to sense how fast the rules are shifting do not just risk defeat. They risk irrelevance. They court catastrophe. The rapid collapse of Ukraine's plan is a modern echo of the Maginot Line, impressive on paper, but bypassed and rendered obsolete by an enemy who understood the new rules of war. The lesson radiates beyond the fields of Zaporizhzhia. Whether you are a general, a government official, or a citizen watching from afar, the cost of misunderstanding the new nature of conflict is measured in more than wasted money or prestige. It is written in lost opportunities, fractured credibility, and consequences that cannot be undone. In this era, adaptation is not a bonus, it is the price of survival. What, then, are the practical steps that can be taken to avoid repeating the mistakes of Zaporizhzhia? First, militaries must invest in resilient, multi-layered communications networks that can survive jamming and cyber attacks. Redundancy is key. The ability to shift rapidly between secure radio, satellite, and even old-fashioned couriers can mean the difference between command and chaos. Second, operational planning must be based on deception as much as on logistics. The lessons of Operation Fortitude during World War II, when the Allies fooled German intelligence about the location of the D-Day landings, remain as relevant as ever. Feints, false convoys, and electronic decoys can complicate the enemy's targeting and buy precious time for real actions to succeed. Third, adaptation must be institutionalized. This means training commanders and staff to expect the unexpected, to question their own assumptions, and to rehearse responses to information-driven attacks. War games, simulations, and after-action reviews must focus not only on what went wrong, but on why, and how to adapt faster next time. Finally, the human element cannot be neglected. Morale, discipline, and the willingness to adapt under pressure are as important now as they were in the time of Alexander the Great or Napoleon. Units that trust their leaders, understand their mission, and are empowered to make decisions on the fly will outperform larger, less flexible formations every time. In the end, the collapse at Zaporizhzhia is not just a story of loss, but a blueprint for future resilience. The armies and nations that learn from failure, that invest in adaptation and information dominance, will shape the wars and the peace of tomorrow. The question that remains for every leader, every strategist, and every citizen is this: will you see the new rules before the ground disappears beneath your feet? Or will you too become a casualty of the invisible war? The answer, as always, will decide more than the fate of any one operation. It will shape the course of history itself.